The floorboards groaned under her weight, a low cry in the vast silence of the prairie night. Blood, dark and sticky, had soaked through the sleeve of her dress, a stark crimson flower blooming on the worn grey fabric. Outside, the wind howled a mournful tune, rattling the windowpane like a restless spirit. Silas watched her from across the room, his face a mask carved by years of hard sun and harder luck. She stood there, trembling but defiant, her eyes holding a desperation so profound it was almost a physical force. In her hand, she clutched the strap of a heavy leather satchel as if it were the only thing tethering her to the world. He had found her collapsed near his well, a wraith materializing from the dusk. He had brought her inside, asked no questions, and waited. Now, she finally spoke, her voice a ragged whisper that barely carried over the storm. "I'm yours tonight, if you want me," she said, the words tasting of ash and surrender. It was an offer born of utter finality, the last currency she possessed. Silas's gaze didn't waver. He saw the bruises on her cheek, the fear that swam behind the bravado. He saw a fighter cornered. He thought of his own fight, the slow, strangling siege laid by Marcus Thorne, a man who bought justice and broke lives with the stroke of a pen. A slow smile, tight and humorless, touched his lips. It wasn't a smile of pleasure, but of recognition, a gambler seeing a single, impossible card that might just change the game. "Then be my wife," he replied, the words dropping into the tense air like stones into a deep well. The proposal was not of love, but of mutual desperation, a fortress built on the edge of a cliff. Her shock was a flicker in her exhausted eyes, quickly shuttered. She processed his words not as a romantic overture, but as the counteroffer they were. A bargain. A sanctuary with terms. He gestured to the simple wooden chair by the hearth, and she sank into it, the heavy satchel landing on the floor beside her with a solid, definitive thud. The contents remained a mystery, but its importance was broadcast by the way she guarded it. "A wife?" she asked, her voice stronger now, laced with a cautious curiosity. "Why?" Silas moved to the stove, stoking the embers back to life. The room was sparse, functional, a testament to a life stripped of all but necessity. "Marcus Thorne wants this land," he said, his back to her as he poured water into a kettle. "He's been trying to choke me out for a year. Legal challenges, blocking my access to market. He thinks I'm alone." "A lone man is easy to break," he turned, his eyes meeting hers. "A married man, with a wife to stand for, that's a complication." "It buys me time," she understood immediately. This wasn't about passion, it was about possession. About law. A marriage was a legal fact, a shield. "And what do you get from this?" he asked, nodding toward her. "Sanctuary," she said simply. "And a name that isn't the one he's looking for." He accepted that, for now. He brought a bowl of hot water and clean rags, kneeling before her without a word. Gently, he began to clean the gash on her arm. His touch was firm, steady, and impersonal, the practiced hand of a man used to mending livestock. Yet, in the quiet care of the gesture, a fragile thread of trust was spun in the space between them. "The preacher comes through on Sunday," he stated. "We'll be married then. My name is Silas." Silas Blackwood. She watched him, this stoic, lonely man offering a pact as wild and dangerous as the storm outside. "Elara," she whispered. It was the first truth she had offered. The next morning brought a fragile peace. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and the earth smelling of rain and sage. The quiet was broken by the sound of approaching horses. Silas, already by the window, straightened. "Stay put. You're my wife." Remember that. His voice was low, a calm command. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she nodded, her hand instinctively finding the satchel at her feet. The door opened to reveal Sheriff Brody, a man whose gut preceded him and whose eyes held the weary cynicism of someone who served two masters, the law and Marcus Thorne. Two of Thorne's hired men flanked him, their hands resting casually on their pistol grips. "Silas," Brody said, his gaze sweeping the cabin, landing on Elara. "Morning. Looking for someone." "A woman. Ran off from Thorne's employ." "A thief." Elara's blood ran cold, but she held Silas's gaze from across the room, a silent plea and a promise. She would not break. Silas stepped aside, revealing her more fully. He placed a hand on the back of her chair, a simple, proprietary gesture. "You mean my wife?" he asked, his tone level. Brody's eyebrows shot up. He looked from Silas's stony face to Ilara's composed one. "Your wife? Since when, Silas?" "Since she said yes," Silas replied, the simplicity of the lie making it impenetrable. Brody squinted, sensing the game but unable to see the rules. He looked at his men, who seemed equally thrown. A legal wife was a different matter entirely from a runaway servant. "Thorne says she stole something valuable," Brody pressed, his eyes locking onto Ilara. "My wife brought only herself," Silas countered. "And she is all the value I require." The air was thick with unspoken threats. Brody, seeing he would get no further with intimidation, tipped his hat. "You're playing a dangerous game, Silas," he warned, his voice low. Thorne doesn't forget. He turned and left, his men following like vultures, leaving a meal they weren't yet ready to claim. In the days that followed, a new rhythm established itself on the Blackwood Ranch. It was a rhythm of shared labor and profound silence. Ilara, it turned out, was no stranger to hard work. She mucked stalls, mended fences, and learned the intricate language of the cattle with a quiet competence that surprised Silas. He watched her, this woman who had offered herself for a night and was now his partner in a desperate charade, and saw a resilience that matched the unyielding landscape around them. Their conversations were sparse, exchanges of necessity. "Fences down by the north pasture. I'll get the wire. The dinner's ready. Thank you." Yet, in the spaces between the words, something grew. It grew in the way he started leaving a bucket of warm water for her by the door at the end of the day, and in the way she mended a tear in his favorite shirt without being asked. One evening, as she was washing, her back was to him. He saw them then, the scars. A lattice of old, healed over wounds that spoke of a cruelty far beyond a simple life of hardship. He felt a cold knot of anger tighten in his gut, a protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. He said nothing. He simply turned away, fetched a clean linen shirt from his trunk, and left it on her bed. She found it later, and though no words were spoken, the gesture was an acknowledgement. A promise. The satchel remained in the corner, a silent, leather-bound ghost, but it was no longer the only secret the cabin held. It now also held the unspoken truth of their shared survival, a bond forged not of vows, but of quiet, mutual respect. The first real attack came without warning. They woke one morning to the lowing of distressed cattle. Silas was out the door in an instant, Ilara close behind. The fence line bordering Thorne's vast, empty holdings had been cut in a dozen places. A small portion of his herd, his most valuable assets, had been scattered onto Thorne property. It was a calculated act of sabotage, designed to cost him time and money, to bleed him dry. "He's testing us," Silas said, his jaw tight with fury. "Trying to see if we'll break." All day they worked, a desperate, two-person team against the sprawling prairie. The sun beat down, merciless and hot. Dust coated their throats and sweat stung their eyes. He rode with a tireless fury, his skill with a rope a thing of brutal efficiency. She proved just as vital, her smaller frame able to navigate the treacherous, rocky gullies to head off strays he couldn't reach. They moved with a synchronized purpose, anticipating each other's needs without a word. By the time the last steer was herded back through the repaired fence, dusk was painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. Exhausted, they slumped against the fence post, side by side. He passed her his canteen, and she drank deeply before handing it back. "We did it," she breathed, her voice hoarse. He nodded, looking at her in the fading light, her face smudged with dirt, her hair escaping its pins, her body aching with fatigue but her spirit unbroken. "Yes," he said, the word holding more weight than a simple affirmation. "We did it." Together in that moment, the line between their pact and their reality blurred. They were no longer just allies of convenience. They were partners. That night, the tension of the day gave way to a different kind of gravity. The shared victory, hard-won and visceral, had broken something open between them. As Silas cleaned his rifle by the low light of the lantern, Ilara finally walked to the corner of the room. She knelt, her hands tracing the worn leather of the satchel. Silas stopped his work, watching her, waiting. He knew this was the moment. She unbuckled the straps, the sound loud in the quiet cabin, and opened it. There was no gold, no jewelry, no pile of stolen cash. Instead, she pulled out a stack of ledgers, bound in twine. She slid one across the table to him. Silas picked it up. His hands, calloused and rough from ranch work, seemed alien against the delicate, precise script that filled the pages. He read the entries, names, dates, sums of money. It was all there. Fraudulent land deeds. Payments to hired thugs. Bribes to county officials. A detailed, damning account of every crime Marcus Thorne had committed to build his empire. It was a confession written by another's hand. I was his bookkeeper, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. My father owed him a debt. When he died, Thorne claimed me as payment. He thought because I was a woman, I was invisible. No one would ever suspect her gaze was fierce, meeting his without shame. He underestimated me. This was my escape. I was on my way to the federal marshal in Stone Creek. Silas slowly closed the ledger. The weight of it was immense, far heavier than paper and ink. He finally understood. He wasn't just hiding a woman, he was harboring the weapon that could destroy the most powerful man in the territory. His fight for his ranch had just become a war for the entire valley. The knowledge in those ledgers changed everything. It was no longer enough to simply endure, they had to fight back. Silas knew he couldn't do it alone. The next day he rode out, not to his pastures, but to the small, struggling ranches that dotted the valley, places owned by men he knew were also being squeezed by Thorne. He took a single page from the ledger with him, one detailing a falsified water rights claim that had nearly bankrupted a neighbor, Jedediah. He found Jedediah mending a harness, his face etched with the same weary resignation Silas had felt for months. Silas didn't speak. He just handed him the page. Jedediah read it, his eyes widening first in disbelief, then in a slow-burning rage. That son of a bitch, he breathed. I knew it, it was a start. The seeds of rebellion, planted in fertile ground of shared grievance. Back at the ranch, Ilara ventured into the small settlement for supplies. The store owner, Mr. Abernathy, a quiet man who had lost his own brother's farm to Thorne's machinations, watched her with knowing eyes. As she counted out her coins, he pushed a sack of flour and a side of bacon across the counter. On credit, he said, his voice low. Your husband is a good man. Doing what needs to be done. He met her eyes, and in that moment, she knew they had another ally. A quiet supporter, but an ally nonetheless. The resistance was no longer just two people in a cabin. It was a whisper spreading through the valley, a network of principled men and women tired of being afraid. Their small stand was becoming a cause. The feeling of hope, fragile but real, was cut short by news that arrived with the evening stagecoach. Marcus Thorne himself was riding out from the capital. He was coming to settle his affairs in the valley personally. The final confrontation was imminent. The air grew still, heavy with anticipation, the day Marcus Thorne arrived. He rode a magnificent black stallion, a stark contrast to the work-worn horses of the valley. He was flanked by his usual enforcers and, trailing behind them like a reluctant shadow, Sheriff Brody. Thorne was not a brute, his danger lay in his polish. Dressed in a fine city suit, he moved with an air of absolute authority, as if the very land belonged to him. He dismounted in Silas's yard, adjusting his cufflinks with deliberate slowness, his eyes cataloguing everything with a cold, transactional gaze. He ignored Ilara completely, addressing himself only to Silas. Blackwood, he began, his voice smooth as oiled leather. I'm a reasonable man. I'm prepared to make you one final, generous offer for this worthless patch of dirt. Take it. Or I will take it, and you will be left with nothing. Silas didn't flinch. He simply moved to stand beside Ilara, a silent, unshakable declaration. Thorne's gaze finally fell upon her, a flicker of contempt in his eyes. Ah, the little bookkeeper. Did you truly think this rustic arrangement would save you? Hiding behind a farmer. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper meant only for her. I own the judges. I own the law. There is nowhere you can run where I cannot find you. It was a direct psychological assault, designed to shatter her nerve. But the woman standing before him was not the same one who had collapsed at Silas's well. She drew strength from the man beside her, from the solid ground beneath her feet. Before she could answer, Silas spoke, his voice ringing with a power Thorn had not anticipated. She is my wife, he said, the words no longer a legal fiction but a profound truth. You'll speak to us both. Together. Thorn's smile vanished, replaced by an ugly sneer. His veneer of civility cracked, revealing the ruthlessness beneath. Enough of this farce, he spat. He nodded to his men. Get the ledgers. And take her. The henchmen surged forward, their intent absolute. Silas moved to shield Elara, his hand reaching for the axe handle leaning against the porch. The world seemed to shrink to the space of the yard, the air crackling with the promise of violence. It was a fight they could not possibly win. But just as the first man reached the porch steps, a new sound broke the tension, with a steady, rhythmic beat of horse hooves. Over the rise, a line of riders appeared. Jedediah was at their head, his face grim, a rifle resting across his saddle. Behind him were a dozen other ranchers, the men Silas had visited, their faces set with the same quiet determination. They fanned out, forming a silent, unmoving semicircle behind Thorn, cutting off his retreat. They said nothing, their presence a statement more powerful than any threat. Thorn spun around, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His power was built on isolating his victims, on the certainty that they would never unite. That certainty had just evaporated. At that critical moment, Sheriff Brody made his choice. He had seen the united front, had heard the conviction in Silas's voice, and perhaps, his own buried conscience had finally stirred. He slowly drew his pistol and stepped between Thorn's men and the porch. That's far enough, Brody said, his voice surprisingly steady. This is a county matter now, Thorn. And I believe Mrs. Blackwood has evidence of a crime we need to discuss. He glanced at Elara, then at the ledgers she now held tightly in her arms. The corrupt magnate was trapped, his authority undone not by a single hero, but by the courage of a community. In the aftermath, the valley breathed a collective sigh of relief. With Sheriff Brody's official intervention and the unwavering wall of armed ranchers as witnesses, Marcus Thorn's power crumbled into dust. He and his men were taken into custody, the illusion of their invincibility shattered. The ledgers, the heavy burden Elara had carried for so long, were handed over to federal marshals who arrived a few days later, their contents guaranteeing that Thorn's reign was well and truly over. The land, once a battleground, was now quiet and full of promise. Silas and Elara stood on the porch of the small cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and freedom. The pact born of desperation had been fulfilled, but it had left something real and enduring in its place. The silence between them was no longer one of tension or uncertainty, but of deep, unspoken understanding. She turned to him, the last of her fear finally gone from her eyes, replaced by a light he'd never seen there before. It's over, she said softly. Silas looked out at the rolling hills, his hills, their hills. He reached out and took her hand, his rough fingers lacing through hers. The marriage had been a lie to protect them, but the partnership had become their truth. No, he replied, his gaze returning to her face. It's a beginning. His smile, for the first time, was genuine, reaching all the way to his eyes. Their future, once a desperate bargain struck in the dead of night, was now a shared horizon, waiting for them. Together. Thank you so much for joining us for this Wild West story. We pour our hearts into bringing these tales of courage and romance to life, and we're so grateful to have you with us on the journey. If you enjoyed the story of Silas and Elara, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. We love hearing from our audience, so please, leave a comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from. It means the world to us to see how far these stories travel. Until next time, take care and stay safe.